Of all the injustices and faults of pre-modern society, one and only one is no longer with us. In theory, eliminated everywhere in the world, but in practice, not yet entirely. Slavery. Enslaving people, stripping from them the freedom and agency that makes a person truly human, buying, selling, and branding them as though they were cattle. Slavery is one of the most vile and brutal things one person can do to another person. And yet, slavery was universally practiced in every ancient society we know of. The civilized and the uncivilized, the tribal, everywhere, from the beginning of recorded history until modern times. But in the late 17th century, this began to slowly change. After the British Empire abolished slavery in 1833, one country after another did the same. And in 1981, the West African country of Mauritania was the last country to officially abolish slavery. How did this sea change come about? How did an institution that everywhere in the world for thousands of years was considered perfectly acceptable suddenly become an abomination, an outrage against God and morality, to be stamped out wherever it reared its ugly head? Let's find out. Welcome to Depth History, where we talk about how the human condition created and creates the human condition. Even though slavery was practiced everywhere, there were in some ancient societies those who were uneasy about enslaving other human beings. But because slavery was so crucial to society's functioning, no one imagined that it could be stopped, or that it even could be stopped. Instead, people found ways to justify it. The 4th century BCE Greek philosopher Aristotle taught that slaves were inferior people, born to serve rather than to lead, unworthy for citizenship. Slavery, he said, was actually good for slaves. It was also perfectly natural because people have different virtues, strengths, and skills. So some of them are born slaves, not good for anything else, and it's natural for superior men, that is, people of Aristotle's social class, to dominate and rule inferior men. In fact, a slave ought to be grateful for the opportunity to learn from his superiors. Also, slavery is good for society, because how else would the unpleasant, dangerous, filthy, dreary work get done? Slavery is the best way for society to get the most benefit from everyone's diverse talents. To our 21st century ears, these justifications are disingenuous and dishonest, just excuses for continuing an oppressive, brutal, and immoral institution. In ancient Athens, where during the golden age of Athenian democracy, 1 person out of 4 was a slave, how could it have been otherwise? There were no home appliances or running water to take the drudgery out of daily life, no tractors or bulldozers or explosive to relieve the back-breaking work in the fields and in the mines. The city's elite couldn't be expected to do physical work. They were too busy with their civic and military duties. Can you imagine these noble citizens chopping their own firewood, or their elegant wives doing the laundry or washing the floors? Without this multitude of slaves, there could have been no leisured class, no Athens as we know it, no flowering of Greek culture, no democracy, no academy, no philosophy, no theater, no Iliad, no Odyssey, but only poor farmers desperately trying to scratch a meager living from the rocky soil. The biblical Exodus was not a condemnation of slavery, but only of the enslavement of one particular nation. The Paschal meal celebrated by the Israelite slaves on the eve of their escape from Egypt had special rules for the slaves who were at the table. In other words, the Israelite slaves in Egypt had slaves of their own. The Torah law assumed that after settling in the Promised Land, the Israelites would have slaves, and distinguished between 2 kinds of slaves: Israelite slaves, who were more like indentured servants who served for a specific time, and foreign slaves who were required to serve forever, along with their children and grandchildren for all generations, and whom it was forbidden to ever set free. Christianity proclaimed itself a universal religion, that all believers stood equally before God. And though many of its believers were slaves, it still sanctioned slavery and accepted without question the Roman social structure. Jesus had said, "So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you." Though these words seem to clearly prohibit enslaving anyone, especially other Christians, church fathers apparently understood them more in the way of treat your slaves the way you would wish to be treated if you were a slave. St. Paul sent a runaway Christian slave back to his master, declaring that he was no longer a slave, but better than a slave, a dear brother. He is very dear to me, but even dearer to you, both as a fellow man and a brother in the Lord. Christians minimized the significance of physical slavery, emphasizing instead the dangers of spiritual slavery. Whatever a Christian slave's expectations of the next life, in this life his conversion had not released him from slavery. Slavery was a punishment for sin, not only for original sin, for which both master and slave were liable, but also for personal sins. The first cause of slavery, then, is sin, whereby man was subject to man in the condition of bondage. Yet, the masters they serve are not themselves free men. To our 21st century ears, these pronouncements sound less like justifications than as advice to slaves not to imagine that Christianity has set them free. And with good reason. As a Roman citizen, St. Paul surely knew that an owner could punish a runaway slave by whipping, making him work in chains, or be branded, or sent to work in the mines. Also, the memory of the last slave revolt, the War of Spartacus, in which more than 6,000 slaves were crucified along the Appian Way, was still fresh. So, advising a slave to patiently wait for the return of Christ and for the kingdom of God, which St. Paul and the other apostles expected at any moment, seemed the prudent thing to do. For the kingdom of God is not a matter of what we eat or drink, but of living a life of goodness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. By the time of the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, when the supply of Slavic and other slaves from the East was cut off, slavery in Western Europe had pretty much been replaced by free workers and serfs. After Spain discovered the Canary Islands and exterminated its native inhabitants, and Portugal discovered Madeira, they needed a new source of slaves for their sugar plantations on those islands. The European navigators, who were just then beginning to explore the sub-Saharan African coast, provided that source. With the first recorded sale of black Africans in the Portuguese port of Lagos in 1444, European slavery began to acquire a racial character. The overwhelming majority of slaves who toiled in the plantations of the Atlantic islands and newly colonized America were black slaves. The accepted justification for enslaving these black Africans was that they'd been captured in battle by other black Africans and had willingly accepted slavery for themselves and their children for all eternity as an expression of their gratitude for not being killed. Actually, most of them were kidnapped in raids that had been undertaken expressly for the purpose of capturing slaves to sell to Europeans. If the Europeans hadn't been waiting to buy slaves in ships anchored off the coast, these raids would never have happened. There was an unending supply of captives only because there was an unending demand for slaves. Over 5 centuries, some 12 million black Africans were transported to the Americas with another 1 million who didn't survive the voyage. This number was in addition to some 10 to 15 million more black Africans taken to the Middle East by Arab slave traders during the 11th centuries of the Muslim slave trade. Slaves first arrived in British America in 1619 at Jamestown in the Virginia colony, the first permanent English settlement in the Americas, only 8 years after it was founded, by pirates who had captured them on a ship bound for Mexico. The pirates exchanged about 20 of the Africans for food. In 1688, when some American and English Quakers had become increasingly involved in slavery as traders and owners, 4 Quakers from Germantown, Pennsylvania, sent a strongly worded anti-slavery petition to their local Quaker monthly meeting. These are the reasons why we are against the traffic of men body, as followeth. Is there any that would be done or handled in this manner, to be sold or made a slave for all the time of his life? There is a saying that we shall do to all men like we would be done to ourselves, making no difference of what generation, descent, or color they are. The petition recalled the words of Jesus. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. This was the first recorded expression of an anti-slavery sentiment in the New World. It's true that some monks in the Spanish colonies had earlier protested the enslavement of Native Americans, but they had only wanted to replace the natives with African slaves. The Germantown petition had no effect, none at all. The monthly meeting kicked it up to the quarterly meeting, which recommended it to the yearly meeting, where it was ignored and forgotten. We should note that although the petitioners believed that slavery was contrary to God's law, they did not demand that slavery or the slave trade be abolished, only that Quakers should not take part in the sin. But what the society around them did was of no interest to them. Why just then? What did these Quakers see in the Bible that no one else had seen for the last 16 centuries? Why did only they see it? In 1689, a year after the Germantown petition, the English political philosopher John Locke, the father of liberalism, wrote, "Slavery is so vile and miserable an estate of man, and so directly opposite to the generous temper and courage of our nation, that it is hardly to be conceived that an Englishman, much less a gentleman, should plead for it." But Locke wasn't talking about actual slaves. He was a shareholder in the Royal African Company, which shipped more African slaves to the Americas than any other company. And he is believed to have had a major role in composing the Constitution of the Carolinas, the unalterable form and rule of their government forever, which specified that every freeman of Carolina should have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves, of what opinion or religion soever, and was granted absolute power of life and death over the slaves. So, no, Locke had a different kind of slavery in mind. Locke knew that there was no possibility that he himself would ever become a slave like the Africans. Writing in the wake of the so-called Glorious Revolution, in which England replaced its Roman Catholic king with Protestant monarchs, he was only concerned that he and his country not be enslaved to the Roman Catholic Church and to the Pope. One word, slavery, but with 2 different meanings. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson, the future 3rd President of the United States, included in his original draft of the Declaration of Independence a paragraph in which he blamed King George III for forcing black slavery upon the American colonists and for preventing them from abolishing it. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. This paragraph was deleted from the final version of the Declaration of Independence in order not to antagonize Southern slaveholders, one of them being Jefferson himself. At one point, he owned almost 200 slaves, and he's believed to have fathered 6 children by one of them, Sally Hemings. But his famous words in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." These words remained, though clearly the slaveholder Jefferson did not believe that these unalienable rights belonged to his slaves. So, not all men, but only free white men were created equal, and therefore entitled to the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here too, one word, liberty, but with 2 very different meanings. By the way, did the words all men also include women, or at least white women? Did they also have unalienable rights? By the mid-18th century, the immensely profitable triangular trade was well established. A ship would sail from Europe to Africa, where it would sell guns, cloth, luxury goods, and buy slaves, whom it would take to the Americas to sell, with many of the slaves dying along the way, and there buy tobacco, sugar, and later cotton, return to Europe to sell those goods, and then buy more guns, cloth, and luxury goods to sell in Africa, and so on and so on. More than 1 million slaves worked the plantations of the European Caribbean islands and American colonies. Absentee planters sat in the British Parliament and in the colonial legislatures. The richest plantation colony of all was the French colony of Saint-Domingue, today Haiti, in the western part of the island of Hispaniola. Beginning in the mid-18th century, widespread popular movements of ordinary people, shopkeepers, workers, housewives, arose in Britain and the United States with the goal of abolishing slavery, not as the Germantown Quakers had demanded for individuals to withdraw from trading and owning slaves, but to abolish slavery altogether. These demands had never previously been raised anywhere in the world. They were something entirely new. For some 2,000 years, Western men thought of sin as a kind of slavery. One day, they would come to think of slavery as sin. In the 1760s, there was nothing unprecedented about chattel slavery, even the slavery of one ethnic group to another. What was unprecedented by the 1760s and early 1770s was the emergence of a widespread conviction that New World slavery symbolized all the forces that threatened the true destiny of man. How does one explain this remarkable shift in moral consciousness if it was not a direct response to an innovation of unparalleled iniquity? The emergence of an international anti-slavery opinion represented a momentous turning point in the evolution of Western man's moral perception, and thus in man's image of himself. Why just then? What did the abolitionists see in the Bible that no one else had seen for the last 17 centuries? Why did only they see it? The words "threatened the true destiny of man" point to the answer. All the early abolitionists were devout Christians, some of them Quakers, who based their anti-slavery sentiments on a new understanding of their religion. Historians have pointed to several contemporary developments that may have inspired the abolitionists. A new personal sense of religious purity, brought about by the religious revivals in the American colonies and in the mid-18th century. Clergymen preached to large crowds, often in outdoor meetings, proclaiming a message that fostered a conviction of personal sin and the need for redemption, and a commitment to personal morality. A growing realization that slaves too were humans, that they too were in need of salvation, and a movement to baptize slaves and provide them with Christian instruction, a movement which was strongly opposed by slaveholders because baptism might raise false hopes of freedom. In the last third of the 17th century, one after another of England's American colonies passed laws explicitly denying freedom to baptized slaves. The conferring of baptism doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. Indeed, St. Paul had written that conversion to Christianity changed only the status of a slave's soul, but not that of his body. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is above both master and slave is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. A revolution in manners, the growth of the man of feeling who transformed the quest for salvation from a sinful world into a mission to cleanse the world from sin. The emergence of secular philosophies that undermined religious authority and demanded that social institutions be justified on secular grounds. The abolitionist campaigns in both the United States and Britain, conducted by pamphlets, petitions to Congress and Parliament, and mass meetings, were vigorously resisted by slaveholders, who appealed to tradition. Slavery had been practiced in all societies since time immemorial, and it was permitted by the Bible. So what was the problem? The so-called curse of Ham in the Bible, actually of his son Canaan, according to which Noah had said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." And since blacks were conveniently assumed to be Canaan's descendants, they could be legitimately enslaved. The identification of blacks with the descendants of Canaan was entirely arbitrary and delusional. It had no basis in theology or science, but it was useful to the slaveholders. Slaves were suited only for lowly menial work that was beneath the dignity of others, meaning white men, but that someone had to perform. As one Southern senator put it in 1858, in all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class, which leads to progress, civilization, and refinement. It constitutes the very mudsill of society and political government, and you might as well attempt to build a house in the air as to build either the one or the other, except on this mudsill. Economic benefits. The products that slaves produced, tobacco, sugar, and cotton, had brought immense prosperity to the slaveholding countries. After emancipation, the countries where slavery was still in force would capture the foreign markets on which that prosperity depended. Slaves were property, and the government had no right to confiscate private property without cause, and certainly not without fair compensation. Emancipation would also ruin the slaveholders, who had invested vast sums in land and equipment. Danger of slave revolts, baptizing slaves, teaching them to read, and even talk of emancipation could only have the effect of encouraging them to revolt, which would result in massive bloodshed. Slaves weren't ready for emancipation. They didn't know how to take care of themselves, and emancipation would create a large class of people who would be a great burden to society. The story of the actual worldwide abolition of the slave trade and slavery itself is long and complicated. With many false starts, it was fought in legislatures, on battlefields, and on the high seas. We'll address this story in detail in a later video, but for now here's a simplified summary. Britain and the United States abolished the slave trade in 1808, but the expectation that slavery itself would die out over the years, as new slaves were no longer being imported, proved a disappointment, because slave populations in the United States and the Caribbean continued to grow naturally. Britain finally abolished slavery in 1833 after decades of parliamentary struggle, and awarded the owners with £20 million compensation, but the slaves got nothing. The United States abolished slavery without compensating the owners when the 13th Amendment to its Constitution was ratified in 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War. Slavery in the crown jewel of the French Empire, Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, was abolished by France in 1794 during the Haitian Revolt, but Napoleon restored it in 1802. The slaves eventually won and founded the Republic of Haiti in 1804. This was the only slave rebellion in history that led to the founding of a state that was both free from slavery and ruled by non-white former slaves. Haiti was forced to pay dearly for its success by France, which, under threat of invasion, in 1825 imposed reparations in the enormous amount of 150 million francs, between $20 to $30 billion in today's money, and by the United States, which recognized Haiti only in 1862 and occupied it between 1915 and 1934. Most of Spain's American colonies abolished slavery in the early 1800s during their wars of independence. Spain abolished slavery in Puerto Rico and in Cuba in 1886. The Empire of Brazil abolished slavery in 1888. The West African state of Mauritania was the last country in the world to abolish slavery in 1981 by presidential decree. However, the decree was not enforced, and the 2018 Global Slavery Index estimated that there were still 90,000 slaves in the country, or 2% of the population. Despite its continued practice of slavery, Mauritania was in 2020 elected to the United Nations Human Rights Council. The worldwide abolition of slavery is the most remarkable moral achievement of Western civilization. It was set in motion not only by the wealthy and powerful, but also by ordinary people, shopkeepers, workers, housewives, and, we should add, former slaves, whose straightforward sense of right and wrong prevailed in a long struggle against powerful entrenched elites, a struggle with many setbacks and many disappointments until justice for society's weakest was finally done. Slavery is today illegal everywhere, but sadly is still practiced in a few countries with dysfunctional governments, for example Mauritania and Libya. According to the International Labour Organization, in 2020 there were 27.6 million people trapped in forced labor of various kinds. If you're interested in learning more about this subject, I've included a list of books to read in the description below. Please join me for the next videos, where we'll be examining in detail individual areas like the rise of religious skepticism and disbelief, human rights, women's rights, and more. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, please click the like icon, share the video, subscribe, and ring the bell so that you'll be notified of new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.